You hear the name Al Capone, and what's the first thing you think of? Chicago, right? He's probably the most notorious gangster in American history. I mean, the guy was a legend, a figure of pure terror, but also weirdly, fascination. He was kind of a twisted symbol of the American dream. But you know, the real story, the man behind the myth, it's so much more complicated than you might think. And to really get who Al Capone was, we have to look way beyond those Chicago headlines.
Back in the roaring 20s, Capone's name was Chicago's criminal underworld. He wasn't just some gangster in the city. For all intents and purposes, he was the city's shadow king. He was this larger-than-life figure who basically defined an entire era of crime with, and this is the crazy part, both his charm and his absolute brutality. So you probably think his story kicks off on the violent streets of Chicago, right? But that's not the whole picture, not even close. To truly understand the man, we gotta go all the way back to the beginning, and to a completely different city. That's right, the guy who would become Chicago's public enemy #1 wasn't from the Windy City at all. His story actually began on the tough streets of Brooklyn, New York, way back in 1899. He was the son of Italian immigrants who were just trying to build a better life for their family.
Honestly, if you looked at young Al, you would never have guessed he'd become a crime lord. He was the fourth of 9 kids, had a regular job in a cardboard factory. He even met his future wife, May, right there on the factory floor. But man, punching a clock was just not going to be enough for him. He had this restless ambition, this hunger for something more. And some really powerful guys, mob bosses like Johnny Torrio and Frankie Yale, they saw that fire in this kid. They saw he was willing to do pretty much anything for a taste of power and money.
And his rise to the top? It was absolutely meteoric. I mean, get this. By the time he was just 26 years old, he had followed Torrio out to Chicago and taken complete control of the Outfit, which was the city's most powerful criminal organization. Think about that. At an age where most of us are just figuring out our careers, Al Capone was already ruling an empire.
So how in the world did he build this empire so fast? Well, like any huge historical figure, Capone was really a man of his time, and his time is defined by one single game-changing law, Prohibition. You know, that period from 1919 to 1933 when selling alcohol was completely illegal.
And what a business it was. Just to give you a sense of the scale here, at the height of Prohibition, the city of Chicago alone had an estimated 10,000 speakeasies. Those are illegal bars. And guess who was their #1 supplier? Yep, Al Capone. He wasn't just breaking the law, he was basically quenching the thirst of an entire city.
This quote right here, it perfectly captures how Capone saw himself. See, in his own mind, he wasn't a criminal, no way. He was a public servant, a businessman, just giving the people what they wanted. He was always going on about what he saw as the hypocrisy of it all, a society that publicly called him a villain while privately buying up all his liquor.
But this whole image of him as just a simple businessman, it was a carefully built facade, and it was masking a really brutal reality. This is where we get to the central contradiction of Al Capone, the respectable, upstanding image he desperately wanted, versus the horrific violence he used to keep his power.
This really was Capone's biggest conflict. On one hand, he played the part of a respectable philanthropist, but on the other hand, he was running brutal prostitution rings, and in one really infamous incident, he personally beat 2 rival gangsters to death with a baseball bat. His real power came from an army of killers driving around in black Cadillacs armed with those notorious Tommy guns.
And he was obsessed with managing this public image. He absolutely hated photographs that showed the scar on his face from an old bar fight. He forbade anyone from even mentioning his prostitution business. If you dared cross that line, you risked, sleeping with the fishes. But despite all this, his popularity was so immense that people would literally ask for his autograph on the street. They said he could have won the Chicago mayoral election without even trying to rig it. But, as they say, no empire lasts forever. Despite all his power, his popularity, and his total control over the city, the walls were starting to close in, and the story of his downfall is, in its own way, just as remarkable as his rise. Capone seemed totally untouchable for one very simple reason. He owned the city. We're talking police, politicians, journalists, even judges. They were all on his payroll. The corruption was so deep that federal investigators often had to hire private detectives because they just couldn't trust the actual police force to do its job.
This created this incredibly frustrating situation for law enforcement. You couldn't get him on murder, he never pulled the trigger himself, and any witnesses were way too terrified to talk. And you couldn't bust him for bootlegging, he had the whole system in his back pocket. It seemed like he was completely, utterly immune to the law.
So how did they finally get him? With the one crime he couldn't bribe, threaten, or kill his way out of: tax evasion. The push to nail him came from the very top. President Herbert Hoover made jailing Capone a key promise, and so federal agents finally found the paper trail they needed to put him away for good.
His conviction really marked the end of an era. The king of Chicago's underworld became just another number in the federal prison system. And his final years, they were a quiet, almost tragic epilogue to such a violent life.
And his downfall was swift. He was sentenced in 1932, then shipped off to the brand new, supposedly inescapable prison, Alcatraz. There, he was stripped of his name and became simply prisoner number 85. He was released after 7 years, but freedom came way too late. The syphilis he'd caught years earlier had been silently destroying him, and he died a broken man at his Florida home in 1947.
The transformation he went through in prison was, well, it was profound. The feared crime lord became a quiet, model inmate. He found religion, really embracing Catholicism. His once legendary temper only ever flared up because of the frustrating and debilitating effects of his illness.
His last few years of freedom were spent as just a shadow of the man he'd been. The disease totally ravaged his mind, leaving him with the mental capacity of a young child. The guy who once ran a criminal empire across an entire city now found his greatest joys in just going to the movies or visiting the corner drugstore to load up on chewing gum and licorice.
And so he's buried back in Chicago, the very city he once ruled, under a simple headstone. And the epitaph etched into it offers one last haunting contradiction for the man who showed so little mercy in his own life, a simple, desperate plea for it in death.